Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel. I am here today with a VR to a tag that I've been meaning to respond to for so long, and I'm just finally getting to film this video. And that tag is TheReaderIAm, and the tag was started by James Feeney, and I'll link his video below. I'm also going to link Casper at the Boy Diviner's responses because Casper's VR is how I found this tag. I've since watched quite a few folks' responses, and I've really been enjoying the VRs to this tag. I think that the questions for this one are really interesting and really do give an insight into, the reader I am, the readers we are, in interesting ways. They're the kinds of things that I'm interested in. And I think I mentioned this on James Feeney's video, actually. Something that I really like about these questions is that they're the kind of questions I'm interested in knowing about someone who I'm thinking about maybe booking a reading with for myself. When I'm looking at a professional reader's, website or brochure or whatever it is, that, the way that they describe themselves and their work and how they work, these are the kinds of things I'm interested in seeing. If I want a reading about a particular question and I'm wondering if a particular reader is for me, these are the kinds of things I look at. So I think that that's really valuable to be talking about. It's interesting for me to answer these questions because I very predominantly read for myself. I do occasionally read for family and friends, but well in excess of 90% of the tarot readings that I perform are for myself. So I will be answering these questions with respect to how I read tarot for myself, unless I mention otherwise. There are a couple of questions, and I've looked ahead and kind of thought about what I might say. There are a few questions definitely that I approach the issue differently if I'm with someone else than if I'm just with myself. So I'll mention that where it feels relevant, but other than that, I'm talking about readings for me. So without further ado, number one, what is the primary system of divination you use as specifically as possible? So the primary system of divination that I use is tarot. More specifically than that, it would be decks in the Pamela Colman Smith Rider-Waite tradition or style. So decks with scenic, fully illustrated minor arcana, not just pips. That's my kind of home base in terms of divination. It's where I started. It's where I feel at home. For sure. I know the question doesn't ask, but of course I'm going to elaborate what else I do. I also read pip decks, some of which are Marseille, of course not all, but I have become a real fan of pip decks as well. So that would be, my next primary. My primary is tarot, and within that, those two systems. I also work very regularly with oracle cards. I work with dice. I recently got a beautiful, beautiful set of dominoes that I plan on learning to work with in a divinatory way that I got from my partner for a Valentine's Day gift that are great. But I don't work with them yet because I don't know how. I also have the journey token system, which I love. So I'm interested in a lot of different forms of divination. I'm learning Lenormand right now, studying. Very slowly, but surely learning that system. So that's kind of my divination snapshot, if you will. Number two, who do you read for? I already mentioned this one. I very predominantly read for myself. Otherwise, I'm reading for friends and family members, people that I know personally. Number three, what types of readings do you do normally? Or do you normally do? There's a couple of do's in that question. And then it says in terms of topics, spreads, time, and medium. So I'm going to address those in reverse order of what's in the brackets, just because I feel like I'll ramble more and more as I go. So types of readings in terms of medium, obviously always in person because I'm with myself. I have done the odd reading over Skype, and I have done written readings as well, and emailed, but by and large in person because they're for me and I'm there. Readings in terms of time, thinking about this in a couple of different ways. In terms of the time span that I will read about for myself, Generally, I'm looking at the present, near future, near past. I don't do, at least not in any predictive way, really, really far ahead into the future readings for myself. I think that there's just too many variables and too many decisions I might make or other things that might happen could affect an outcome. So when I do something like a year ahead spread, it's not predictive. It's more to just give me something to reflect on each month. So pretty close to the present. I will occasionally work with the cards to go kind of deep past for myself, delving into, the experiences of my younger self, but that's not the bulk of what I'm doing. So right around present. And then also thinking in terms of time, if I'm doing a reading, how long am I sitting at the table, or how long does that reading take me to do? That again also depends. I will sometimes just draw one card or one tarot and one oracle in the morning, have a look at them for a few minutes, do a little journal in the morning, or look back at them in the evening and do a little journal, and then I'm not sitting very long. I'm just kind of thinking about the cards, throughout my day. But other times when I do a larger reading for myself, which are also tend to be the readings with a broader time scope, we'll say temporal scope, there we go. If I'm reading for myself, say at a new moon or a full moon, and looking at kind of the next bit of the moon phase and what I'm thinking about in that context, I will sit at usually my tarot reading table, and I could be there for hours, writing and thinking and, reflecting and having some tears and, whatever I might need in that moment. I could be sitting for quite a while. So some of my readings take a long time. And that's true I would say reading for others, I'm pretty, a reading with me for someone else is often fairly long as well. When I do read for friends and family, it's often doing a spread for something like a birthday, or New Year's. I'll occasionally get asked for, something like a year ahead for a friend, and then we're chatting and enjoying each other's company and looking at a lot of cards. So it'll be a longer reading experience as well. Do I use spreads? Yes and no. Not always. If it's just something like a dailyish draw, there's not really any spread there. I really like designing spreads. This is something that is really, in terms of my personal tarot practice, central. I don't work with a lot of pre-designed spreads too much. Sometimes I'll find some that I want to try out, from a book or something like that, but mostly I'm designing my own. I design my own tarot spreads around new moon and full moon, around what's going on in the sky with reference to my own birth chart as well. So I'll read my horoscopes for my sun and rising signs and work from those to come up with questions for spread positions for each new and full moon, which is something I really enjoy doing. And then I have some go-tos, some of which I've gotten from other places, but many of which I've designed myself, for things like on a birthday. I'll do the same spread on every birthday. But I also sometimes like to just lay out the cards and see what happens without a spread. I just always make sure that I know in advance what I'm doing. So if I'm reading with a spread, I'll have chosen the spread obviously before I start shuffling. And if I've decided not to read a spread, I just want to draw some cards, I always know how many cards I'm going to pick. Maybe I'll do a grid of 9 or something like that, or just 3 cards and read them together. But I always have a set idea about how the cards are going to be laid out on the table and how many of them and in what positions, because that's something I think about when I'm also thinking about the question or the topic at hand, and setting an intention, that either the spread positions will mean what they mean, or that I will get an overall image of the answers or ideas that I'm looking for. So I'm always decided ahead. Readings in terms of topics, I will go to the cards for myself about most things. I think that this is a kind of issue that when you're a professional reader, and I've watched, lots of VRs on this, and some professional readers will mention here in terms of types of readings they'll mention things that are like, on offer in their shop, or perhaps topics that they don't read about for clients. So, lots of people don't read on health questions or don't read on legal questions, for ethical or for liability reasons. I think that those kind of considerations are obviously quite different when I'm just reading for myself. If I were involved in some kind of legal proceeding and wanted to do a reading about how I would experience that proceeding, I wouldn't have the same concerns I might have as if somebody, a friend or a paying client came to me and asked something about a legal issue. I think it's a quite different set of considerations. That said, I don't read for myself about issues related to physical health. I have anxiety. I've had anxiety for a long time. And one of the ways that my anxiety can manifest itself is in bouts of hypochondria and, hyper scrutinizing of my body and my wellness. And so I've learned, in terms of self-care and being good to myself, that reading for myself on those kind of things is not a good thing for me to be doing. So I don't touch that. But other than that, I will do readings for myself when I have a big decision to make. I'll do readings about, career trajectory. I always do readings at kind of special times. So solstices, equinoxes, full moon, new moon, birthday, New Year's, any of those. I really like to design a spread and then do a reading for myself. I'll read about my relationships, or at least, my experience of my relationships and how they're affecting me. I often do readings for myself around helping to identify my needs in terms of things like self-care. Again, not about physical health and symptoms and things like that, but maybe what do I need to focus on today? What do I need to just leave aside today? These kinds of questions that I can then help self-guide my own thinking, if that makes sense. Number 4, what is your reading style? Analytic, intuitive, spiritual, predictive, fortune, ... etc. In some ways, all of the above, I think. To me, when I think about analytic reading, I think about the ways that my reading of the cards is always informed by all of the years and years of study that I've done and the books that I've read and the techniques that I've learned, whether that means looking for different kinds of elemental associations or numerology, or whether that means just traditional card meanings. That to me is in the domain of the analytic. So that is always there. I think sometimes analytic and intuitive get kind of contrasted, right? As though they're not compatible. And I think they absolutely are compatible. And I'm always working with my intuition and reading intuitively, and sometimes something will just, really stand out, and that's an intuitive hit, and I absolutely get those intuitive hits, and I take them really seriously, but that in no way for me is exclusive of thinking about things in a more analytic fashion. I do perform what I would call spiritual readings for myself, absolutely, in terms of thinking about ways to connect to my environment, connect to the sacred through the cards, connect to particular ancestors. All of that is kind of in the very broad umbrella domain of spiritual reading for me. So absolutely. I do read predictively for myself and for other people if they want, but always for me, always with the understanding that it's a kind of if-then kind of predictive, right? I don't think that there's anything, particularly contentious about prediction. I think we do it all the time. Sometimes, some folks are really, hesitant to say that they do predictive reading or don't do predictive reading. That's totally fine. This is a thing that is so personal for everybody to think about. But for me, I have no problem predicting that if I study, I'll do better on a test than if I go out to the pub the night before, right? And that's a prediction, but there's a really good basis for that prediction, at least for me. So when I'm doing a predictive reading, it's always kind of premised on either if I continue doing what I'm doing, if I continue down the path that I'm on, or if the person continues down the path that they're on, or if I make this choice, and I don't know, take the promotion that involves moving city. Maybe here's what I've got in store for me, and here's maybe what I've got in store for me if I decide to stay where I am, right? These kind of predictive I do. And I don't often use the language of fortune telling. And I think that the language of fortune telling sometimes gets just kind of dismissed as like, oh, well, that's not what we do. That's a kind of caricature. Tarot readers aren't fortune tellers. That's not what they do. And I think historically, first of all, that's not true. People, including, members of my family and fairly immediate ancestors have absolutely made their living fortune telling. And that's not something that I in any way look down on. In terms of what maybe is intended by fortune telling, I've never done anything like, for example, being a tarot reader at like a fair or an event or a party, which is maybe now what I think about when I think about fortune telling. Someone who's kind of set up at a booth and you can go up and have. If I had that opportunity, I would definitely, think about doing it. I've never done it before, so it's not a style of reading I do now. But again, I have no issue with it and would probably try it out if I had the chance. Okay, so moving on, because again, I could ramble about all of these questions for so long, so I'm really trying to restrain myself because James gave us such good thought-provoking questions here, and I have so much to say. Okay, number 5. What type of readings do you conduct? For example, evaluative, coaching, empowering, reflective. Of those 4, the only one that I would say that I do not do is coaching. Coaching is not language that I identify with at all. And in reading for myself, it's not a word that I would ever use to describe anything that I do. And again, this is not me saying I don't do that. I'm not saying other people shouldn't do that. It's just not a way that I think about my own reading for myself. And it's not a way that I've ever read for anyone else either. I absolutely read evaluatively. I think that something that tarot for me, or divination in general, but tarot for sure, has proven to be really helpful in is decision making. And I don't mean that to sound disempowering, like I'm letting my deck make my big life decisions for me. Absolutely not. But I do think laying out those cards, and option A, B, and C, or A and B, or however many choices there are, and looking at these and thinking about, pros and cons for decision making, to me, that's evaluative reading. And I think tarot is actually really great for that. I always, keep in mind that I'm, of course, the one doing the evaluating for myself. But tarot is a great tool for that. Absolutely. I always want to read for myself and for others in ways that are empowering. I am not going to, not acknowledge it for myself or not acknowledge it for someone else if perhaps there's something showing up in a reading that feels less than positive. But there's nothing disempowering about that, right? I think that insofar as we read predictively, tarot can help us, be better prepared for eventualities that are maybe ones that we don't prefer, or can help us make decisions that might mean that we can kind of mitigate certain kind of negative outcomes. And I think that that's an important part of empowerment and feeling able to do that. So I read for myself in that way, absolutely. And I would want anyone that I'm reading for to, walk away from that experience feeling more empowered than when they came in, for sure. And reflective, I would say, always I draw cards just for the purpose of reflection, sometimes even for meditation, for myself all the time, for journaling, for sure. This is all reflective reading for me. And I will do those kinds of readings for others as well, to give, ideas of things to think about. Number 6, what is your ideal reading atmosphere? So I shared earlier in a tag called Where I Tarot, which is a couple videos back on my channel if you want to check it out. I have a tarot reading table in my house where I do most of my reading for myself. And I also like to read outdoors for myself as well. I love to go to a local park and sit by the pond in particular. Sometimes I'll just read for myself out in the backyard. I like to be outside as much as the weather here permits, as much as I possibly can be. And particularly if I'm doing, readings for myself that maybe fall into the kind of spiritual reading category. For me, having a nature-based spiritual practice and spiritual path, being outside feels really powerful for me for reading. And I always take a reading cloth, of course, because I don't want my cards to get covered in dirt. But, outdoors is great. Indoors, I love a candle. I love some incense in terms of atmosphere. For sure, I think that for me, when I'm reading, it helps me to really get, centered and in the mindset of drawing some cards to go through some of those atmospheric things, right? To sit and ground myself briefly, to light a candle. I like to have representations of all the elements on my reading table always. So I always have some water. I'll have, maybe some new moon water, full moon water, a feather for air, earth from the ground under my house for earth, and a tea light for fire. So I like to have those present. Some incense. I think I usually just have like Nag Champa incense, which puts me into that kind of mode, I guess, of thinking, and helps me to center my mind and kind of set aside anything else that might be nagging at me when I'm doing a reading. And I think for me, that's a lot what atmosphere, is getting into that mindset. And I'm happy to read for someone on the kitchen table, but I like having a dedicated tarot area in my house for myself. In terms of atmosphere, I think I would struggle in an atmosphere that was too noisy, like doing readings in a pub. I think that I might have a hard time. But yeah, I'm flexible in terms of atmosphere, but I also very deliberately cultivate the atmosphere in my house, if that makes sense. Number 7, reversals, ? Jumpers, ? Shuffling style. Okay, so my shuffling style, I have a deck here. I have the Spacious Tarot. My shuffling style is overhand, always overhand. If I have a deck that's really, really huge, I might overhand end to end. But actually, I have yet to own a deck that is so big that I can't just overhand my usual way. I have a pretty big finger span. So even with my biggest decks, which I think are Le Tarot Noir and maybe Next World Tarot are really big cards, I can still hold them like lengthways like this to shuffle. So always the same way. I never riffle unless I'm playing a card game. I will riffle and do the riffle and bridge with the cards. We play a lot of card games in my house, cribbage mostly, but others as well. But I only like to overhand with tarot and oracle. And when I'm reading a spread for myself or someone else, like particularly if I'm reading like a lot of cards, I always cut the deck as well. So I'll have the deck and I'll cut it into 4 piles, and then I'll bring the deck back together and then draw the cards. If I'm just drawing a single card, I don't usually go through 4 piles necessarily, but it's an intention that I always set from the beginning of what I'm going to do. Jumpers, it depends. Whether I read a card that jumps out is, intuitively something I do sometimes and not others. I watched Corvin Green's response to this tag this morning, and they were saying that, sometimes a card jumping out is just because I've been a sloppy shuffler, and I totally relate to that. And the same. And if the cards just jump out because I'm making a mess and not paying attention, I don't necessarily take that as a card I'm going to read. But sometimes a card jumps out and it jumps out. So then I listen when it does that. Reversals. This is something that my thinking is ever evolving on. I learned to read tarot with reversals. However, now I read reversals only sometimes. If you would have asked me this years ago, I would have said, of course I read reversals. How could you not read reversals? You get so much more meaning if you have reversals and all this. And now I'm a bit more flexible. And there's a couple of things that factor into whether I'm going to read reversals or not. One is if I'm using a spread with very specific positions or not. So if I have a spread where each position means something quite specific, I'm less likely to use reversals, right? Because thinking about that, let's say I have a position in the spread that has to do with obstacles, obstacles that I might encounter in whatever it is that I'm reading about, and a card comes up that is really a card that we think of as being a very positive card. And I'm looking in here to see if it might come up, and of course it won't. But let's say I have an obstacle position in a spread and the sun card comes up, right? Because obstacle is built into the spread position itself, I don't need the sun card to be reversed to understand that that card is appearing there in that moment, in that reading, as an obstacle rather than as a positive force, right? Whereas if I'm reading just kind of freestyle, say in a grid of 9 cards, I'm more likely to use reversals. So that's a kind of interesting thing, I think. If I do say so myself, I think that is an interesting thing that I do. I'm also more likely to read reversals if I'm reading with a pip deck. This, I think, is in part because I learned to read pips or Marseille decks from a couple of books, namely Untold Tarot by Caitlin Matthews and Tarot on Earth by Tom Benjamin. And both involve reversals. And I have come to understand, more positive and more negative, we'll say, or more upright and more reversed sets of meanings for solely numerical minors. So I do read reversals more if I'm working with a pip deck. And incidentally, those things usually go together. So if I'm working with a pip deck, I'm also more likely to just freestyle as opposed to using a spread. So I'm more likely to use reversals. And when I shuffle and I want to have reversals, then once I've done some overhand shuffling, I will do one of these and make sure some of the cards are reversed. And then I will just do another couple of overhands, and maybe I'll do that again to make sure some are reversed, and shuffle again. So reversals sometimes, for sure. I always think of, I think it's in the Tarot History Symbolism, Tarot History, Symbolism, and Divination or something like this by Robert M. Place, that book. He talks about how, if you are reading in a spread and you draw 3 cards per position and you read them together, you can get a lot more nuance and a lot more potential combinations and a lot more meanings than if you just read with reversals, right? Reading with reversals kind of doubles the potential possible outcomes of flipping a card over in your deck. But if you put a few cards together in a spread position, it gives you far more. So I will say that I'm also a big fan of that approach, and I often will put a few cards in each position. So if I do something like a 3-card spread, that's often, something that becomes a 9-card spread for me. Number 8, what is your delivery tone? For example, constructive, positive, reflective, action-oriented, etc. Okay, so mostly I read for myself and I don't talk to myself when I do. I will reflect and write out, I'll free write associations and write what I see and see where I end up. When I'm reading for someone else, I would say that my style is very conversational. I'm not overly imposing about what I what I'm finding. I like when I'm reading for someone else and we have a conversation, of course, beforehand about what a reading is going to look like if I'm reading for someone for the first time, and to get an idea of their needs and also so they can get an idea of what to expect. I like if I'm talking about something that I see in a reading and the person I'm reading for knows what I'm getting at. If they're like, oh, well, I know you're talking about my boss there. Or, yeah, my partner and I, we're dealing with this issue. I want them to tell me that. It's better than guesswork, I think, right? I think you can have a more productive conversation that way. So I do like that kind of conversational way. I really, like to establish when I'm reading for someone else in person that, by no means is the idea that they need to just kind of sit there passively and silently and be kind of filled up with information. Not at all. It's to me, having a reading is a participatory thing if you're being read for in person. Obviously, if I was reading for someone who just emailed me a question and I emailed them a reading back, it's a different thing. But most of my readings are not done like that. So definitely conversational. I definitely want to be a reader who is constructive. Again, the word empowering came up earlier. I would not want to leave someone feeling, like I took the air out of their balloon or something. I don't ever want to do that. That's not to say that, again, I'm going to not mention if something problematic or difficult seems to be coming up in a reading, but it is to say that, I want to be an empowering reader for sure. And in terms of the idea of action oriented, this isn't necessarily language I would have thought of to think about my reading style in, but it does resonate with me, action oriented, in terms of both how I read for myself and how I read for others. When I'm reading for myself, it's not just because I want to know stuff, it's always with an eye to informing my thought process, informing my decision making. So in that way, it is absolutely action oriented. Number 9, what are some of your personal reading quirks? For example, correspondences you tend to draw on, habits you have, little details that you alone use and have. I don't know that anything that I do is so unique to me that it constitutes a quirk. I will say something that I do when I'm performing a reading for myself or for someone else, that is a multi-card, larger reading, is I always kind of like to start with a big picture look and then zoom in slowly. So I always am first looking at things like, is there a preponderance of one suit? Is one suit completely absent but the other 3 represented, more equally? Are there a lot of court cards, all kind of looking at each other and what might be going on there? If so, are there a whole lot of majors? Are there no majors? What's a kind of elemental balance? I read with elemental associations for suits. So I get that kind of overall kind of snapshot first. And this is something that if I'm reading for someone else, I will be kind of talking out and maybe remarking upon, there's a lot of this kind of, energy going on there. And then start getting into looking at, this one individual card or these 2 cards together in more focus. I do incorporate reading directionally. So kind of, who's looking at who's walking away from who, in a larger spread. I like to take that into consideration. I feel like things like astrological associations may come more into play a little bit as I learn astrology, but not too much now, really. I don't know if I have any little habits. Oh, when I'm reading for myself at my reading table, I always start my reading before I start shuffling by ringing a bell. I don't know if that's the kind of thing this kind of question is asking for. I have some different bells and chimes and things, and I like to just kind of mark the beginning and ending of the time that I'm spending reading the cards with a sound that kind of clears out, mentally it clears everything out for me. And then I will ring the bell again at the end. When I've read for other people at their kitchen tables, I haven't like brought the bell with me. But when I'm reading for myself, I always do that. Yeah, I guess those are the things that I can think of. I don't think I have any quirks. Do I have any quirks? Who knows? Do you know that sometimes I feel like your quirks are things that other people are better at noticing than you? It's like your tell when you play poker. Like you probably do it all the time and you might not even think about it just because you do it all the time. But those are my answers to the 9 questions of The Reader That I Am VR to James Feeney. And again, I'll link the original video below. Do check out this tag. I think that these questions really get us talking about various aspects of how we work with tarot that are interesting. And I feel like I have a little bit better idea of people's reading styles. Even folks whose channels I've been watching for quite some time, folks who've answered this tag. It gives you a little window into how people think about what they're doing. That's really interesting. So if you've done this tag and you're not sure if I've seen it, let me know and I would love to check it out. If you have any answers to any of the questions you'd like to share in the comments, I'll put the questions for the tag in the description box below, so do feel free, whether you have a channel or not, to share your thoughts on any of these. I hope it's been fun. I've had fun answering these questions. I wish you all a good day, and I will see you again soon. Have a good one.